All right. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. I'm very excited to moderate this book talk today, where we'll hear from Maria Fedorova, professor of Russian studies at McAllister College, and she'll be talking about her newly published book, which I have here, uh, Soviets, Americans, and Cooperation in Agriculture, 1921 to 1935. Sorry, Seeds of Exchange, Soviets, Americans, and Cooperation in Agriculture, 1921 to 1935, published with NIU Press. That's right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Thank you so much,
perfect.
Nick.
And yeah, we're happy to have everyone here. And I'd like to begin just having Masha tell us a little bit about the project, where it started, and what got
Mhm.
you interested in the history of agriculture and exchange in the early Soviet period.
Yeah, again, thank you so much for being with us. I'm very excited to talk about this book. It's been, I feel like, a decade since I started working on this project, and it took me in many different directions. But in the end, the product is this book. So I came to this topic probably from a weird angle. I came to the United States in 2010, thinking that I will major in American history, and that's what I did for my master's. And I wrote about anti-intellectualism, so that was so far from agriculture. But
Could
when
I
I was,
interrupt you there
yeah,
and tell us a little bit about what got you interested in American studies and
oh,
anti-intellectualism?
um, I was so from my early childhood, I loved learning English, and the only version of English that we were learning was British English. So when I got into university, um, I decided that I would like to pursue my studies of English, but I did not want to study British history anymore. So my choice, fell on the United States, and I got interested in the history of the New Deal, of
Mm.
Huey Long, populism, the 1930s, and his appeal to this American anti-intellectualism, what Hofstadter will call
I
American
see. I see.
anti-intellectualism. This were like the roots of my interest in American history.
And we can see that a little bit in the book. So let's continue with the narrative. So you come to the United States. What year was that?
Oh, 2010. Yeah.
Okay. And where did you go?
Oh, I went to Pullman, Washington State University. Go Cougs. Yeah, but my ticket was from Moscow to Moscow. So if you're familiar with American geography, Moscow, Idaho is 6 miles away from Pullman, Washington, and that's where the airport
Wow.
is. So yeah, I was flying from a big city to quite a small rural town called Moscow in Idaho. So yeah, that's where I spent the next 2 years from 2010 to 2012.
And at this time, did you continue kind of researching this 1920s period of American history? How do we get
Yes.
from that point to the current research
Yeah,
book?
so I continued working on the 20th century American history. And the project that I wanted to write my doctoral dissertation on, was the history of American anti-intellectualism. But at some point, I think lots of us in grad school go through this intellectual crisis when we're not satisfied with our topics anymore. I had this at the end of my first year, and my advisor, Nelson Lichtenstein, then told me, well, what do you like to write about? And at that, or what do you like to do generally? And I said, at that time, I really like baking bread. And he said, okay, just write about bread. And this is how I switched to food history, because I did not, like before 2010, 11, 12, I did not even really consider food history
Mm.
as my field. But when I started writing about bread, and I chose the First World War as my chronological focus, it got me so interested in food production and consumption and regulation of food by states and international regulations. And this was my entry into the topic of food, and then later into agriculture.
I see. And could you tell us a little bit about when you started working on this research project? What had other scholars, either Russian, American, or elsewhere, written about this period of either American history, Soviet history, and how did you envision your project contributing something new to that
Yeah.
story?
Yeah, so I was inspired by historians who looked at transnational connections. That always interested me, and I thought it was so important to show that nations just do not exist by themselves,
Mm,
but even during crisis or during closure of borders, there are always those connections that remain subtle and maybe hidden, but they stay there. And I wanted to look at those connections because I was also a representative of these connections, right? Because I came to the United States, and I wanted to look into that history. So I started reading works that focus on the circulation of knowledge or exchange or transfer, and looking back at history of the United States and Russia and then the Soviet Union exchange. I found that much has been written about the technological transfer, for example, of agricultural technologies from the United States to the Soviet Union. And I felt like that was not enough to explain the exchange, and I wanted to see whether the Russian Empire and then the Soviet Union were active participants in that exchange. So, and that was my kind of that was the field that I entered and started thinking about that.
great. Yeah, thanks for that. And I think we'll talk about some of the examples in just a moment, like
Mhm.
the ARA and some of the other the American Soviet Exchange and the Russian Agricultural Bureau that you're talking about in the book. But could you tell us a little bit? Okay, so you developed this project. You want to kind of bring this transnational story to the Russian American history of exchange. Where do you go looking for information? Tell us a little bit about your research process, because what's often really interesting about transnational history is that you're globe hopping. You're going all over the place. You're visiting different archives. What did that look like for you?
Oh, that was I first of all, I love archives, and I managed to go to so many different places because what I decided to do in the book is not to focus on governmental institutions, because that would take me only to one archive. I decided to focus on individuals who traveled back and forth between the United States and the Soviet Union. And that meant that I had to go and track personal papers in many different archives. So my first stop was Hoover Institute in Palo Alto, near Stanford, and that is an incredible resource. They have so many papers of Herbert Hoover, but also of his papers of the Food Administration and then the American Relief Administration that worked with Soviet Russia, that sent food aid during the Volga famine. Later, I had a whole trip across the Midwest. Tracing archives from Lincoln, Nebraska to Iowa, and then Chicago, and I also went to Wisconsin. And each archive had several collections of personal papers of agricultural experts, economists who went to the Soviet Union or who came from the Soviet Union to the United States. And then I also spent several years in Moscow, my hometown, and I worked also mainly in Central Archives, but also managed to get papers from the Perm archive where Americans went to work. So it was an exciting process to work with so many, not only collections, but also with so many individuals who helped me along the way.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. And it sounds like a really exciting process, and to see these connections playing out from archives and individuals from all these different places must have been really exciting. Could you tell us,
Yeah,
I'm
well,
wondering.
let me tell you,
Oh,
like the
sure.
one more comment about the archives. Like later on when I finished my dissertation and I needed to write one more chapter about Montana, um, we my husband's relatives, they live in Montana, so every time we would drive there, I would feel like that Soviet agricultural experts just following the steps of those people, because I would drive through North Dakota, seeing this land, and then through eastern Montana, where lots of agricultural experimentation happened. So yeah, I felt like this is the field of my research, and now I'm kind of living the life of those people who came here in the 30s and the 20s.
That's really great. I had a similar experience because I was looking at Soviet experts who visited New Mexico in the 1950s, and I also took their travel path, or at least a small part of it. And I was trying to imagine what they must have thought about as they were going through the desert. But
Mm-hmm.
so thank
Yes.
you. Yeah, it's kind of interesting to follow in the footsteps of our historical actors. But
Mm-hmm.
I was hoping we could go back and talk a little bit more about the actual content of the book, because you
Mm-hmm.
mentioned the ARA, the American Relief
Mm-hmm.
Administration, and this history during the Volga famine. Could you tell us a little bit about that, and how you talk about it in your book, and what you found at the Hoover Institute?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, in terms of the content of the book, I uh, chronologically I cover the years from 1921 to 1935, and this I see these years as the most active years of the U.S. Soviet exchange. It doesn't mean that the exchange did not happen after 1935 or before 1921. It did, but I see these years as the years of very active experimentation and openness, during which both Soviet and American experts actively traveled back and forth, exchanged information, sent each other seeds, letters, literature, etc. So after 1935, this exchange it becomes more rare, and due to probably things that we're going to discuss a little bit later. But the book starts with the Volga famine and the American aid to Soviet Russia.
Could you
In
just remind us of what
Mhm.
a few lines about the Volga famine, when it happened,
Yeah,
why it happened?
absolutely. Yes. In the summer of 1921, Maxim Gorky appealed to the international community asking for food aid to the starving populations in the Volga region. The famine has already been in that region for several years, and the Bolshevik authorities, despite their attempts to combat famine, they were just not able to do that. So foreign aid was necessary. And among other organizations, there are many organizations that responded to that call, including international organizations, European groups. The United States offered more aid than anyone else. And that aid was provided by the American Relief Administration. And the history of the American Relief Administration is that it was a successor of a wartime institution called Food Administration. So, Food Administration provided food aid to European allies during the First World War. But once the war was over, the Food Administration ceased its existence. In its place, the American Relief Administration started working. And Herbert Hoover, who initiated the organization of Food Administration, he now unofficially presided over the American Relief Administration. So there was a lot of lobbying from American farm groups to provide aid to Soviet Russia, because not only would it help the famine-stricken regions in the Volga area, but it would also help American farmers, because by 1921, the American government stopped supporting prices on wheat, so the prices dropped. The American farm sector was in crisis, and because of also overproduction, the American farm sector needed to do something with all this wheat and corn, so they found its place and they sent it to Soviet Russia. So that's the context. That's when I start the book. And while researching this topic, I came across this very small part of the collection in Hoover Institute that talked about pro-communist groups, and they Hoover called them radical relief. And it was very interesting. What was this radical relief? And these were, as I said, pro-communist groups organized by the Friends of Soviet Russia that focused not only on providing food aid, but they advocated the so-called long-term aid, which also included technological aid and aid and expertise. So they organized sometimes agricultural communes, sometimes groups of agricultural experts, machine engineers who would go to the Soviets and teach them how to plow, how to sow with this modern equipment. And they would also try to bring tractors and other agricultural implements to Soviet Russia. So then I started thinking about the question, but what kind of food aid does really aid, short term or long term? And that's the kind of the question that drove my research in the first place.
Could you tell us a little bit more about these? What did you call them? Radical
relief. Yes.
Radical relief.
Hoover didn't like them. Yes.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, who are these people? Where are their backgrounds? Do they have affiliations with the Communist Party in the United States, or are they independent thinkers? What motivates them to go to Russia? I assume this is in the early 20s, right?
Yeah, this is happening. Yes, this is happening in the early 20s, and they're all organized by the Friends of Soviet Russia, which is a pro-communist group to support Soviet Russia, not only in agriculture, but in also other ideologically, economically. So this group raises money to send these experts, and one of them was Harold Ware. And Harold Ware was a member of the Communist Party. He got interested in agriculture early in his 20s, and he was inspired by the revolution, but he also saw the plight of American farmers, and he felt that by aiding Soviet Russia and by working with Russian peasants, he can learn something about the new organization of farms, about the new farmer worker that if he brings American farmers to, say, Perm or Pitigorsk, and they can see what the Soviets are doing, they can see these kind of new models of agricultural organization. American farmers can learn from it, and then they can come back and teach their fellow farmers about this new experiment that the Soviets are doing. So that was he definitely believes in communism, and he is an agricultural organizer in the United States, and he puts together several, I would call them missions to the Soviet Union. The first one was in 1921-22. The next one is 25-27. And then later he comes back in 29. And every time the projects that he was involved in were getting bigger and bigger and bigger. At first, in 21-22, he brings a very, very small unit. He calls it the American Tractor Unit to Perm. In 25, it's a larger state farm that he works on, and he brought even his family with him. And that was in near Pitigorsk. And then the final project that he took part in was near Rostov-na-Donu. So that was in 1929.
And is there any attempt to look at what they're doing in Soviet Russia and implement this in Montana or somewhere else in the United States?
Yeah, so he so there's no I did not find evidence that he would come back and organize a Soviet type model farm anywhere in the United States. But what he does, he um, after he experimented in Soviet Russia, Harold Ware came back and organized a tour together with some of the members of the Communist Party around the United States to
Mm.
look at the situation of the American farm sector there, and he found a very pitiful situation. Like, the American farmers were suffering, and he tries to, through propaganda, through teaching materials, through spreading knowledge about the Soviet experiment, he tries to persuade American farmers in the viability of the Soviet
Mm.
project.
Mm.
Whether he was successful or not, I think that he gets a little bit more successful closer to in the Depression years.
Right.
Because his organization managed to put together hunger marches in Washington, D.C. But he's not successful in really pushing American farmers towards the communist model. But he's doing his best. He's definitely doing his best.
Right. Something else I want to talk about, because as I was reading the book, what was really intriguing, and I think you hinted at it in your introduction, is looking at the way that this is not a one-way exchange. Even in our conversation so far, we focused on Harold Ware and traveling to Russia, but a lot of the book is about Soviet Russians, and not only Russians, but Soviet Russian agronomists and other types of
Mhm.
experts also coming to the United States. So could you tell us a little bit about that,
Yeah.
and also maybe about seeds? Why are seeds so important to your story?
Yes, absolutely. Well, I'll start with Soviet agricultural experts who came to the United States. Um, this part of the research was uh, quite intriguing for me because I did not expect to find much. I expected to find maybe one, two people who came to the United States and maybe stayed in Washington, D.C. and worked in the USDA and with those experts. But as I started looking more into the history of this exchange, I found that so many well-known experts and also not known at all came to the United States in the 20s and early 30s. Amongst the well-known ones, and everybody probably knows his name, was Nikolai Vavilov. But there were lesser known names like Nikolai Borodin, and there was Nikolai Tulaikov, and others whose names then I felt like my mission is to recover those
Mm.
names and to tell their stories and what they experienced as they came to the United States. So what drove the Soviets was also that famine, that Volga famine, and the issue of food security. They felt this responsibility of finding plants that will be able to resist droughts and other weather conditions that would affect the harvest so much. That what they wanted to do is to find some ways to prevent future famines.
Mm.
And they try to find seeds in the United States, because at this point, the United States is one of the leading plant breeding places. So they try to find these newest varieties that will help to prevent future famine. So that's the issue of food security. And so, yeah, in my book, one of the chapters talks about the organization of the Russian Agricultural Bureau in New York, and that was organized by Nikolai Vavilov and Dmitry Borodin. It was in 1921, and the bureau functioned up until about 1926, and then it was absorbed by a larger Soviet organization. And the goal of this bureau in New York was to exchange seeds and literature, and also experts. So when, for example, whenever Soviet experts would come to the United States, their first stop would be that bureau, because
Mhm.
that bureau will provide them with letters of recommendation, for example, to the USDA, and those were kind of like tickets to entering the United States, and to get familiar with American experts. So that is that was a part of the story. And after they received all those letters, after they went to the USDA, the Soviet experts would travel mainly in the Midwest, and also the Pacific Northwest, also the Great Plains. That will be kind of their area because of the similarities in climates and in soil conditions. Some of them still wanted to see also the American South and travel to California, but not a lot of them did that.
And how important were these seed exchanges and visits to experimental stations in the actual changes in wheat production or
Mhm.
whatever it is that they're borrowing from the United States in Russia itself?
Yeah, it was an important step, because as I was looking at letters that Vavilov received when he would return back from his trips, and the letters from different agricultural experiment stations from all over like Soviet Russia and just other parts of the Soviet Union, you could see the interest in American seeds, and particularly in corn seeds. I did not track whether they were implemented in any particular areas, but I know that lots of local experimental stations wanted to acquire those seeds so that they could experiment. And that was the problem then for Vavilov, because what he wanted, just a small seed exchange, like small packets and not really bulk shipments of seeds. But Soviet agronomists asked him for more and more and more seeds. And he would try to tell them, look, it's the 1920s. We do not have money, enough money to purchase so much. Yeah, so the demand was there. It was a matter of then logistics to deliver those seeds to the Soviet Union.
Right, and it must have been really difficult at the time, yeah,
It
to
was,
organize
yeah.
all
There
of
were
that.
lots of complaints about damaged seeds or
Mm.
damaged plant varieties that would just, or lost ones that would be shipped from the United States but would never get to Soviet Russia.
I also wanted to ask you a question, building on something that you just said. If I remember right, you said that the Russian American Bureau was replaced, I think, by Amtorg, right, in
Yes, it was, yeah.
1927. Um, that gets us into a bigger question about the chronology of your book, because this is a very early Soviet story. What changes? I mean, there's the obvious changes that come in the 1930s, but I was wondering how your um, story contributes to our understanding of Soviet science and Soviet history in general,
Mhm.
through the lens of these intellectual and expert exchanges.
Yeah, so just to give like a little background, what happens in before 1926, Vavilov and Borodin ran the show at this Russian Agricultural Bureau, and they were supported by the People's Commissariat of Agriculture, by Alexander Smirnov in particular, because they favored Vavilov's intent to cultivate relationships with other countries, and on a more personal basis. So after 1926, 27, we see a shift in the People's Commissariat of Agriculture in terms of its leadership and the priorities. So the priority now was to establish a tighter control over organizations like the Russian Agricultural
Mm.
Bureau, um, and to manage their resources. So we can see this shift towards a state control, from the control by individual experts to more like a state focused approach. And in that, I think we can see what Krementsov would talk about as Stalinist science, a shift to the also the shift to a different generation of scientists and a growing distrust of experts who were taught and worked during the imperial regime. Because in 1928, during the a conference on Marxist conference on agriculture, we see already the kind of condemnation of Kondratiev and people who were close to him about their approach to agriculture and to collectivization. So, and I think that the same thing is happening to the Russian Agricultural Bureau as new experts, red experts or agricultural experts, are coming in to the People's Commissariat of Agriculture. They start questioning the older bourgeois experts and their authority, and the Russian Agricultural Bureau suffers.
Yeah, could you actually go a little bit into this? This is chapter 2, I think, right, where you talk about Nikolai Kondratiev, and not only him, Chayanov, Makarov, and others. Tell us a little bit about this tension. Like, what's at the core of this tension between this new generation of Stalinist scientists and those who came before? Like, aside from their backgrounds, what's different about their ideas?
Yes, there are ideas. This is a big moment for Soviet agriculture because Stalin and his supporters favored the idea of going towards forced collectivization, while Kondratiev, Makarov, Chayanov were in favor of continuing the new economic policy and its model. And yes, they did not deny collectivization entirely, but they were talking about the fact that the Soviet Union was not ready for this kind of step. And that was what sort of led to the initial purges of this group. And while Vavilov was not a part of that group, but we can see that there is a change in how also American expertise was treated. Because Kondratiev and Chayanov, Kondratiev actually went to the United States in 1925, and he wrote this amazing report on how effective American agricultural bureaucracy was, how wonderful the experimental stations were, etc. So he sort of admired the American approach, and him looking at the American model as something to perhaps replicate in the Soviet Union was another reason for him to be purged later. Those foreign connections became just one of the reasons for the ostracization of these experts.
Yeah, thank you. And related to that, I'm kind of curious. So we see an end of these individuals, at least their personal careers, if not their lives, in this period. But is there a lasting impact of these exchanges on the Soviet system in your mind? And keeping in mind that, there used to be a time when we would focus so much on Lysenko and his role in Soviet science. But I'm curious what your perspective is on the legacy of this period on Soviet agricultural science in general.
Yeah, I think that the legacy is the rejection of the American model, and the belief that that the Soviet model was, the agricultural model was superior to the American one. And what contributed to that was the Great Depression that hit the United States in the late 20s and early 30s. That sort of motivated the Soviet leadership to look down upon the American way of farming, and gave them the reason to say that the Soviet model was much more superior. And I think that rejection in itself kind of leads leads the Soviet Union away from collaboration with the United States up until like the late 50s. So it was a very short period of time, and then there is a war, so there is also not a lot of time to collaborate on agriculture. There were some attempts in the 40s, but I think that for this short period of time, there is a very significant shift away, and also kind of critical perception of the American model.
I see. Um, yeah, that's really interesting, because even there you see that the entanglement between the United States and the Soviet Union matters, right? Maybe it's not that we're borrowing U.S.
Mm-hmm.
expertise, but we're seeing how U.S.
Yeah.
agriculture is failing, and we're trying to define our system against that. So I think it's really telling and speaks to the very interesting story that you're telling here. Let's shift a little bit, because I think we've been very focused on the Soviet story, but I'm curious to hear you talk a little bit about this idea of food sovereignty, because we know
Mhm.
that this is not a concern only to the United States or the Soviet Union. But is there anything that studying this period of Russian-American relations around these issues might tell us about the history of food sovereignty as a movement? Or, I mean, is there any optimistic lessons that we can pull out of this early period?
Um, I think that there are lots of, maybe not optimistic, but lots of good lessons that we should think about. Because I think that the period of that surrounds the First World War is critical in our understanding of food security, because this is the first moment when the international community puts together some sort of effort that is not a national effort to combat food security, but it is lots of different countries are involved in providing food aid to different participants of the First World War. And I think Bruno Cabanet emphasizes that this is where we see the origins of humanitarianism, and including food aid. So that's why this period is so important in understanding these early efforts at collaboration at the international level. How do countries come together and recognize a common problem like food insecurity, and how do they provide aid, what types of aid this is, how do they structure this aid, do they just give it, or is it a credit? So all of these questions can be studied by looking at the First World War, and that's one of the chapters actually that did not chapters of my dissertation that didn't come part of the book. It focuses on this question of the Food Administration and those radical relief organizations, and the different types of aid that they provide. I think that this is the First World War is this moment when states understood that food production, consumption, and distributions were key to winning the war, and also key to keeping stability but in the world, globally. Because right after the war, even during the last years of the war and the first years after, providing food aid was more than just feeding people. It was an attempt to keep democratic regimes intact in Europe. That was the kind of the mission of the American Relief Administration, also to prevent the spread of communism. Because one of the lines that I remember reading one of the speeches by a member of the Food Administration. He said that revolutions come from bread lines, and I'm probably misquoting right now, but that's the idea, is that if people are hungry, they're more likely to turn to communist ideas. And so if we feed people, if we feed our European allies during the war and after, that will help us to prevent the spread of communism. So yeah, that's
But that's interesting then. So why does Hoover decide to provide aid to the first
Yeah.
communist government that took
That's
place.
a great question. Like in the archival sources that I was working with, Hoover would state that he was aiding not the regime, but he was aiding Russian people. And
Hmm.
that emphasis on Russian people was everywhere in the documents, in official documents, in his private correspondence, or even in propaganda posters. Like in propaganda posters, we see, like, one of them is this big ship that is bringing corn to people in the Volga region, and we can see only the people. Like this kind of very, I don't know, traditional depiction of Russian peasants in poor clothing with a bare foot. All of that. Those kind of the idealist version of a peasant in the American minds. So yeah.
I see. I see. That's interesting. Well, I'd like to take the next few minutes, if you're up for it, Masha, to offer you the opportunity to read maybe a favorite passage from the
Hmm.
book, so that we can give the audience a window into what the book is like. So, is
Yeah.
there any specific part that really speaks to you, or was a particularly um, important part for you that you'd like to read for us?
Yes. Yeah, I would like to read. I have this chapter 5, that we did not talk
Right.
about, but this chapter is about an American agricultural economist. His name was Milburn Wilson, but he went by M.L. Wilson. Uh, and his trip to the Soviet Union in 1929.
Okay.
So,
And what was the purpose of that trip? Or
so
I
the
guess,
trip, yes, the trip was, Wilson, together with Ware, were invited to organize the 100,000 acre farm near Rostov-na-Donu.
hmm,
The farm was called State Farm Number 2, or some other called it's Verblud. Uh, so he was invited to do that, and um, because he did so much of agricultural experimentation in Montana, he felt that this was just the next step to see how such large scale farms could be organized.
hmm,
And this is just a little excerpt from the book about him preparing to go to the Soviet Union. Okay, so the grandiose and groundbreaking nature of the project and the opportunity to become a part of this experiment were what attracted Wilson the most. In February 1929, he wrote to his brother outlining his responsibility, and I quote, for the establishment of the largest tractor wheat farm experimental station and demonstration in the world. Wilson highlighted that under his and Ware's supervision, the Soviets would construct a unique grain farm that would follow out a factory system throughout, from special tasks to 8-hour work shifts. Moreover, what impressed Wilson was the ambition to transform a farm into a more than a wheat production unit. The creation of Verblud as a self-sustaining farm city intrigued him. State Farm Number 2, designated as an experimental and educational учебно-опытный grain farm, featured not only fields and machine shops, but also schools, communal buildings, and living quarters.
hmm,
Wilson described to his brother a splendid machine shop that would be carrying out all kinds of mechanical experiments with wheat machines, and schools in which hundreds of graduates from Russian agricultural high school and colleges would train in the implements and mechanical side of the use of the equipment.
hmm,
In the end, these graduates, Wilson believed, would become professionally trained managers and foremen for other state farms in the Soviet Union. For Wilson, participating in such a project was an opportunity to glimpse what the future of agricultural production might look like and assess the potential of the Soviet strategy. Thus, brimming with excitement, On April 13, 1929, Emil Wilson, along with Harold Ware and L.J. Fletcher, boarded the ship President Harding in New York City and set off for the Soviet Union.
Great. Two questions.
Yeah.
Why did they call the farm Verblut? And what was it that speaks to you about this passage, or that you find
Mhm.
so interesting going back to it?
Yes. So before the farm was there, the first workers, these were Soviet workers who arrived there to build the farm. The first thing that they saw at the train station where they arrived were camels.
I see.
And that's where the farm got the name Verblut. So what speaks to me in this passage is Wilson's ambition, Wilson's vision, and hopes um, to find solution to how to organize these large-scale farms efficiently. Because yes, there were some experiments in the United States with these types of agriculture, but there were not a lot of them, even in the 1920s.
Yeah.
And nobody would give so much land in the United States to one expert and say, just go for it and organize a very big farm. And here the Soviets are saying, okay, we are creating this farm that is not even a farm, it's a city. It has everything, the whole infrastructure, schools, communal buildings, cultural center. Like, it's a new type of living arrangement and work arrangement. And for me, this is the moment when Wilson realizes that there is something going on in the Soviet Union that he must see and he must be a part of. And that's why he agrees to participate in the project.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And we already have some questions coming in, so we'll use this opportunity. If you do have questions, please put it in the chat, and we'll do our best to answer them. So the first question comes from Alexander Safronov, who says, "Good evening. I would like to know the following detail. Did the USSR get technology from the United States for the development of its machine tool industry?"
Mm-hmm. I know. So this is not a part of the book, not a part of what I focus on, but just reading general historiography on the transfer of American technology to the Soviet Union. Yes, there was technology that the Soviets received from the United States, and I know that the Soviets were very interested in this, and that they communicated this interest with American experts in Washington for sure. Because I saw many letters of asking about different about asking them to send literature to the Soviet Union about different technologies. And I know that also the Americans, not only did they bring tractors, that they brought other agricultural implements to the Soviet Union with them.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you for that wonderful answer. The next question, I don't have a name here, but did engineers from the USA take part in the building of the Kharkiv tractor plant?
That's a great question. Kharkiv tractor plant unfortunately did not come. It was not a part of my research, so I'm not sure. I don't think that I can answer this, but I will be happy to look into this or to recommend literature on this. So if you would like, you can email me. So my name is on the Macalester College website, and I will be happy to be in touch with you and point to the answer.
Yeah. Oh, we have another question. What do you find challenging and rewarding about researching transnational history, and what is the research process for this type of thing? So, for this type of transnational project?
I think that the most rewarding part is seeing different perspectives on that people share this similar passions and ideas, in my case about agriculture, and looking at all of this and looking at how people collaborate despite political tensions, despite ideological differences across borders. That is the one of the most rewarding experiences about researching transnational history. What's challenging about it? There are a couple of things. One is to track sources. That is definitely one of the most challenging things, and also choosing what stories I'm going to tell and what stories are going to be left behind. In my particular case, one of the most challenging things was to look at the history of famine in the Volga region, and to read the stories of people who suffered through this, and also to read the stories of these Soviet agricultural experts, many of whom perished during Stalin's repressions. That was probably the most challenging part. And as for research process, the research process, I think that identifying a topic, which is not very difficult, because there are so many issues that are transnational issues and global issues, and then you allow yourself to imagine how different people reacted to this issue, and that's how you begin this process, and then you just follow the stories and follow those people.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you. We have a moment for another question or two, if there are any. Now is the time. We'll take a moment. Maybe while we do that, I just wanted to comment and ask you, Masha, to talk generally about this period of technological transfer, and because we do know that a lot of experts, at least until the mid 1930s, were involved in yeah, changing agriculture, building industry. You know, some famous examples like John Scott, who was present
Mm-hmm.
in
Mm-hmm.
Magnitogorsk, but others. Can you talk a little bit about that history of
Mm-hmm.
international expertise in the early industrialization of the Soviet Union?
Yeah, there were definitely lots of American experts, and not only American, also European experts who were involved in the process of industrialization and also agricultural modernization. And I think that one of the most interesting parts of this, like what motivated them to go to the Soviet Union.
Mm,
And as I was reading secondary literature and archival sources, I found so many different reasons why foreign experts traveled to the Soviet Union. Many of them were ideologically motivated, and believed in the Soviet experiments and wanted to take part in it. And similar to John Scott, right, who went to Magnitogorsk. Um, some of them had some family ties, and their expertise was so important. For example, when I was looking at agricultural communes that were sent to the Volga region and also to Ukraine and to other parts of Soviet Russia, one of the requirements for these foreign agricultural experts was the knowledge of the Russian language,
mm,
and who could know the Russian language? Only those people who immigrated to, say, to the United States in the late 1800s or early 1900s, and then acquired some expert knowledge in the United States so that they could, share it with the new Soviet state. So those familiar ties, language ties, what motivated people to go. And also another interesting part of why some American experts wanted to go was the high pay. They were, they, so for example, in the chapter on Emil Wilson, after he came back from the Soviet Union, he got so many letters from American farmers and lower ranked experts about like what the salaries are like,
mm,
who is hiring. We would like to go, because the United States experienced those depression years, so many of these experts were out of work, and they saw this go into the Soviet Union as a lucrative opportunity to work there, and also where they felt that their expertise would be valued.
Hmm. Wonderful. Yeah, and that fits with what I've seen as well. In the 1920s and 1930s, you have these experts who are sympathetic in some ways to the Soviet project, but then in the 1930s, there are more immediate concerns.
Hmm.
And that was certainly what Scott talked about in his book.
Yeah.
Um, so thank you for that. And I think we'll use that to wrap up our conversation because I don't see any more questions in the chat. So I just wanted to thank you again, um, Masha, for coming and talking about your book, Seeds of Exchange, Soviets, Americans, and Cooperation in Agriculture, 1921 to 1935, at a very affordable price. I know because I ordered one as soon as it came out. So check it out. And thank you, everyone. And thanks to the American Center in Moscow for hosting our conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nick, and thank you everyone for listening and for participating in our discussion. And thanks to the American Center for hosting us.